I'm Eric, this is the Commander's Beacon. Let's talk about some unconventional ways to build your commander decks. And today we're talking about Octavia Living Thesis from Commander 2021. This is an 8/8 elemental octopus. It costs 8 blue, but it costs 8 less to cast if you have 8 or more instance and or sorcery cards in your graveyard. It also has Ward 8, which means if Octavia becomes the target of a spell or ability your opponents control, that spell or ability is countered unless they pay 8. As you're probably aware, Ward 8 is basically hexproof, but with some minor upside like being immune to effects that get rid of hexproof, like Arcane Lighthouse and Bonds of Mortality. And lastly, and probably most importantly, Octavia has Magecraft. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, target creature has base power and toughness 8/8 until end of turn. So building around Octavia is pretty self-explanatory, but we do have a few options. First, there are a number of creatures that become silly when you boost their power to 8. The most notable is Cephalid Constable. This is a 1/1 that costs 1 blue, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may return up to that many permanents that player controls to their owner's hands. Yes, this does include lands. This guy doesn't have any evasion, but if you manage to turn him into an 8/8 and get in for combat damage, your opponent probably won't have any lands left in play. There's simple unblockable creatures like Triton Shorestalker, and even better, Invisible Stalker, which also has hexproof. Or Tetsuo Umezawa, which can make any of your little creatures unblockable, and then you can always cast an instant after blockers are declared but before combat damage is dealt to boost their power to 8 with Octavia. But remember, Octavia needs you to have a bunch of instants and sorceries in your deck. The more of these little 1/1 unblockable Yuriko flunkies we add to our deck, the fewer instants and sorceries we'll have. And these little 1/1s are not very effective at all when Octavia isn't on the battlefield. And whenever I build a deck, for the most part anyways, I try to make sure that the deck still works, even if you don't get to use your commander. So instead of unblockable 1/1s, I focus this deck on creature token generators. And this makes sense. You would expect to see Shark Typhoon and Talrand in an Octavia deck. These cards reward you with creature tokens whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, or, well, any non-creature spell in the case of Shark Typhoon. The tokens created by these permanents have a little bit of evasion with flying, so they have an easier time getting in for combat damage when we turn them into 8/8s. And if we can't get Octavia to stick on the battlefield, any of these token generators has the potential to flood the board with tokens just for doing what we were going to do anyways, cast instants and sorceries. So we still have a chance to win even without our commander. And another reason I prefer these creature token generators is that we don't need as many of them to get our deck going. Let's say I build around unblockable little creatures like Invisible Stalker. How many of these unblockable 1/1 creatures do I need in my deck? If I just have one on the battlefield, is that enough? Well, probably not. But with token generators like Talrand, having just one of them on the battlefield is enough to create a bunch of tokens for me. I don't need as many token generators in my deck, which leaves me more room for instants and sorceries. And, well, that's about it. Octavia is very interesting, but not very complicated. So let's get into the contents of the deck. I'll start by talking with how we're going to fill our graveyard with instants and sorceries so that we can cast Octavia as soon as possible. Okay, so when you build around Octavia, the first question you might ask yourself is, how am I going to get 8 or more instants and sorceries into my graveyard? Will I use self-mill? If I cast Traumatize targeting myself, I'll mill half of my library, so I'm pretty sure that alone will enable me to cast Octavia for just 2 mana. Now, Traumatize is 5 mana, but there are cheaper options too, like Dream Twist for a single blue mana at instant speed. I can mill myself for 3, and it has flashback so I can do it again. But I'm actually creating card disadvantage when I use one of these self-mill cards. Octavia's Magecraft ability triggers when we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, which I mostly can't do if my hand is empty. Once I have 8 or more instants or sorceries in the graveyard, I don't get any benefit from adding any more. Cards that I can only use to mill myself might be dead draws in the later game. Now, if I wanted to focus on self-mill, I might consider Court of Cunning. This enchantment makes you the monarch when it enters the battlefield, so at least it'll replace itself. And if you're generating a bunch of creature tokens, it might be easy to keep the monarch. Plus it mills whoever you want to at the beginning of your upkeep, for 2 cards if you're not the monarch, or 10 cards if you are. A Court of Cunning didn't quite make it into my deck list, but I think it's a pretty good card for an Octavia deck that I haven't seen other people using, so I wanted to mention it. Anyways, instead of focusing too much on self-mill, I'm using a bunch of card draw and discard effects. That way I'm still filling my hand, or at least maintaining card parity for the most part, while giving myself some card selection and filling my graveyard. A Mental Note is probably the most efficient example. For 1 blue mana at instant speed, I mill 2 cards, but I also draw a card so it replaces itself. Chart a Course lets me draw 2 cards at instant speed, then I discard a card unless I attacked with a creature this turn. So if I really need the card advantage late game, I can cast this after my combat step if I attacked, but if I want to fill my graveyard, I can just cast it before combat so I can discard a card with it. A Search for Azcanta isn't an instant or sorcery, but it lets me look at the top card of my library at the beginning of my upkeep, and I can put it in my graveyard if I want to. There's creatures like Bonded Fetch and Thought Courier which let me tap them to draw a card then discard a card. Now I mentioned that I don't want much dedicated self-mill, but I do make space for Contingency Plan. If you want more of this effect, you could also use Taigam Scheming. These are both 2-mana sorceries that let us look at the top 5 cards of our library, and then we can put any number of them into our graveyard, and the rest back on top in any order. So this is basically Surveil 5. I'm using these effects because, while it is technically card disadvantage, I'm not drawing any cards through this, it does help me filter through my deck to find what I want. Rather than milling myself indiscriminately, Contingency Plan and Taigam Scheming let me choose to put specific cards in my graveyard, like instants and sorceries, or any card I just don't want to draw soon, while I can keep things that I actually do want to cast on top of my library. Now I also want to mention some of our bigger spells that help fill our graveyard while giving us card advantage. Of course, we'll use Fact or Fiction and Windfall. These are already very popular cards that give us card advantage at a pretty good rate, while also dumping some things into our graveyard. But I also want to mention Manifold Insights. This is a sorcery that costs 2 and a blue. You reveal the top 10 cards of your library, then each opponent chooses one of those cards, you put the chosen cards into your hand, and the rest into your graveyard. So for 3 mana in a typical 4-player game, you'll get the worst 3 of the top 10 cards of your library, and you'll get to put 7 cards into your graveyard. Now this does exactly what we want to do in this deck. 3 cards for 3 mana is a pretty good deal, even if it's, the worst 3 cards out of your top 10. And we'll get a bunch of cards into the graveyard as well. Now finally I want to mention that there's a few popular card draw spells on Octavia's page on EDHREC that I would really recommend you not use. Dig Through Time and Treasure Cruise have Delve, which most of the time we won't want to be using since we want to keep at least 8 instants and or sorceries in our graveyard. And you really don't want to be casting these without Delve either. They cost way too much mana for that. Now I guess you can exile permanents from your graveyard to help cast these, but I'm still not sure they're really worth it here. We really want to make sure we can fill our graveyard, and there's plenty of spells to choose from that do this. There's also stuff like Impulse, which lets you look at the top 4 cards of your library and put one into your hand and the others on the bottom of your library. Impulse is a fine card, but if I want to fill my graveyard, I'd rather use Strategic Planning. This lets me look at the top 3 cards of my library and put one of those into my hand and the others into my graveyard. So generally this is going to be much more synergistic with Octavia than something like Impulse. So we're running a bunch of these card draw effects. There are 22 of them in this deck. So ideally we can churn through our deck and fill our graveyard to at least 8 instants or sorceries pretty quickly. Now let's talk about some of our creatures and our creature token generators. Now, I mentioned that I don't want to fill my deck with a bunch of creature cards that specifically want to become 8/8s with Octavia's Magecraft ability. I'd rather use cards that make creature tokens, but I will include a couple of creature cards that just work really well. So yes, I made a space here for Cephalid Constable because it's that good. We do have ways to help get it in for combat damage to opponents, which I'll mention later. So Cephalid Constable can absolutely devastate an opponent when Octavia turns it into an 8/8, so it should be in this deck. I've also included Ghostly Pilferer. So this is a 2/1 that costs 1 and a blue, and it has a lot of abilities. First, when it becomes untapped, you can pay 2. If you do, you draw a card, so it gives us card advantage. Secondly, whenever an opponent casts a spell from anywhere other than their hand, for example, casting their commander from the command zone, we get to draw a card, so even more card advantage. And lastly, we can discard a card to make Ghostly Pilferer unblockable until the end of turn. So not only can this help us get it in for combat damage when Octavia boosts its power to 8, we can also use this discard ability to help us fill our graveyard to help us cast Octavia in the early game. Ghostly Pilferer is absolutely perfect for this deck, so it gets a slot. But other than these two, most of our combat-oriented creatures are going to come from token generators. Murmuring Mystic, Talrand, Dika, Fractal Theorist, Docent of Perfection, Metallurgic Summonings, Shark Typhoon. I don't feel like I need to discuss each of these cards individually. They all reward us with a creature token for doing exactly what our deck wants to do anyways, casting instants and sorceries. Some of these tokens have flying, like the birds made by Murmuring Mystic, Talrand's Drakes, or the flying sharks from Ikoria, because Ikoria. So all of these flying tokens are great targets to turn into 8/8s with Octavia's Magecraft ability, because they're going to have a much easier time getting in for combat damage. Now technically, Dika can actually make those tokens completely unblockable, but it's 4 mana for each one, which is kind of a lot. Now I'm running 2 other token generators. Nadir Kraken is a 2/3 Kraken that lets us pay 1 whenever we draw a card, and if we do, we make a 1/1 tentacle creature token, and we put a +1/+1 counter on Nadir Kraken. So having to pay mana for our creature tokens isn't great, but we've also kind of reached the limit of good creature token generators in blue for a Spellslinger deck. The good news is that if Nadir Kraken sticks around for a while and accumulates a bunch of those +1/+1 counters, those will add to its power when we turn it into an 8/8 with Octavia, so it can be really, really big. But it doesn't have evasion, so you'll need some help getting it in for combat damage. And lastly, I want to mention Golden Guardian. This is a 4/4 artifact creature with Defender. You can pay 2 and have it fight target creature you control, and then when it dies this turn, you return it to the battlefield transformed into Goldforge Garrison. This is a land that can tap for 2 mana of any color, or you can pay 4 and tap it to make a 4/4 Golem artifact creature token. So this is an unusual inclusion in this deck, but there's a few reasons I've included it. First, we can easily use Octavia to transform the Golden Guardian into Goldforge Garrison just by having it fight Octavia. Now, Goldforge Garrison only makes 1 token at a time, and it has to tap to do so, and it essentially costs 6 mana since we're tapping 4 plus the Goldforge Garrison, which would otherwise have tapped for 2 mana, so this is not great. And the tokens it creates are already 4/4s, so Octavia doesn't boost them as much when she turns them into 8/8s. But one of the big reasons I've included this is that if you look at the other token generators in this deck, like Talrand, Murmuring Mystic, Dika, a lot of them are creatures. We have 8 token generators in this deck, and only 2 of those other ones are non-creatures. That's Metallurgic Summonings and Shark Typhoon, which are enchantments. And we have no graveyard recursion in this deck. So Golden Guardian is sort of a backup plan for making creature tokens. If our opponents have removed all of our vulnerable creatures that generate creature tokens, or even, maybe our somewhat less vulnerable enchantments that make creature tokens, we can still use Goldforge Garrison, which is a land once you transform it. It's pretty unlikely that this will ever get removed, so Golden Guardian is our really inefficient but very, very resilient creature token generator option. But that's our token generation. Let's move on and talk about our win conditions. So our primary win condition in this deck is to make a bunch of creature tokens and use Octavia to make those tokens into 8/8s to knock out our opponents with combat damage. Or if we can't keep Octavia on the battlefield, we can possibly still produce a bunch of tokens with our token generators and just win through combat the same way. But we also have a few effects that help individual creatures get in for combat damage. We can use these on creatures like Cephalid Constable, or on Octavia itself to try to go for commander damage. First, I want to mention Artful Dodge and Maximize Altitude. These are efficient 1-mana spells that give the target creature unblockable or flying, respectively, until the end of the turn, but I like that these are recurable. Artful Dodge has Flashback, and Maximize Altitude has Jumpstart, so both of these can be cast from the graveyard. What's cool here is that I can discard these cards to one of my draw and discard effects to fill my graveyard to help me cast Octavia, but I can still use these again later. Or if I don't have any draw or discard effects, but I really just need to fill the graveyard, I can just cast these, maybe even on an opponent's creature if I need to, just to get them into the graveyard. And I can still, again, reuse them once later in the game. We'll also use Shadow Rift. This is a 1-mana instant that gives target creature Shadow until end of turn, and we draw a card. And we'll play Leap the same way. It gives a target creature Flying until end of turn, we draw a card. So similar, we can cast these to make something generally unblockable, or if we need to fill the graveyard, we can just cast it on anything early in the game. We can't reuse it, but at least it replaces itself. Finally, I'm using Key to the City. This is an artifact that costs 2. You can discard a card and tap it to make a target creature unblockable this turn, and when Key to the City becomes untapped, you can pay 2 to draw a card. So this helps us get in for combat damage with our 8/8s or our commander, and we can use it to help fill our graveyard, and it does at least give us card selection because we're discarding a card to tap it, and then we can pay 2 to draw a card to replace that discarded card when it untaps. Now, outside of making things unblockable, let's talk about a few more cards that help us win the game. First, let's talk about Dragon Throne of Tarkir. This is an equipment that costs 4 and it equips for 3. The equipped creature has Defender, and it also has pay 2 and tap this creature. Other creatures you control gain Trample and get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is this creature's power. So when you equip this onto Octavia, Dragon Throne of Tarkir is basically our mono-blue version of Craterhoof Behemoth or Overwhelming Stampede, because we can pay 2 and tap Octavia to give all of our other creatures +8/+8 and Trample until end of turn. Dragon Throne of Tarkir is an excellent finisher if we've got a bunch of tokens on the board with Octavia, and maybe not enough instants or sorceries to boost enough of them with Octavia's Magecraft ability to finish off our opponents. Now keep in mind that if you want to completely surprise your opponents with Dragon Throne of Tarkir, and you probably do, then you'll need to cast, equip, and activate it all in the same turn, and this will cost you a pretty hefty 9 mana, but we're in mono blue, so we can't play Craterhoof Behemoth, so we'll take it. Next I want to mention Sphinx Bone Wand. This is a classic Spellslinger finisher. It's a 7-mana artifact that does nothing when you cast it, but despite that, we do want some non-combat finisher options, and Sphinx Bone Wand is one such option. It has whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you may put a charge counter on Sphinx Bone Wand. If you do, Sphinx Bone Wand deals damage equal to the number of charge counters on it to any target. So the first instant or sorcery spell we cast after resolving this will let us do 1 damage to something, the next one we cast will let us do 2 damage, then 3, and so on. And lastly, we have a spicy one with Mist of Stagnation. This is an enchantment that costs 3 blue. It has permanents don't untap during their controller's untap steps. Okay, so that's a little bit disgusting. It also has, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player chooses a permanent for each card in their graveyard, then untaps those permanents. So as long as we're filling our graveyard to cast Octavia, with Mists of Stagnation, we should still be able to untap all of our permanents each turn. Maybe not all of our tokens if we just happen to have a bunch of them and they're all tapped, but if our opponents don't have much in their graveyards, this can pretty much just stop them from playing Magic. If you cast Mist of Stagnation when an opponent is tapped out and maybe only has a few cards in their graveyard, they're basically skipping at least 1 turn to untap maybe a few lands and then cast removal on Mist of Stagnation, if they can even do that. So Mist of Stagnation is a mean card, but there are a few things we need to be careful with. First, if you resolve this and then an opponent exiles your graveyard, you're going to have a very bad time. So there's a bit of risk here. Secondly, if your opponents have a full graveyard, Mist of Stagnation won't hurt them at all. But in mono blue, we don't have many options for exiling graveyards. Sure, there's stuff like Crook of Condemnation or Scavenger Grounds, which exile all cards from all graveyards. This is a good way to grind the entire game to a halt, since then no one will be untapping anything, but don't do that. I realize playing Mist of Stagnation is not a great way to make friends, but if you follow it up by exiling all graveyards, that's a completely different level of unnecessary suffering. But we can use effects like Learn from the Past or Clear the Mind. These spells say a target player shuffles their graveyard into their library. Not only will this defeat those decks that are abusing their graveyards like Muldrotha, but we can also use these to target a specific player, maybe a player with lots of cards in their graveyard, so they won't be able to untap anything when we have our Mists of Stagnation in play. I also like that Learn from the Past and Clear the Mind are instants and sorceries, so they help us cast Octavia when they're in our graveyard, and they trigger Magecraft when we cast them. They also say draw a card, so they replace themselves if we don't need the graveyard hate. Now, I've personally only included one of these in the deck, because it's mostly here as a combo with Mists of Stagnation, but you include more if you really want to focus on this effect. So those are some of the ways that we can finish games, but I want to talk about some of the supporting cards, like the lands, ramp, and removal, that make the deck work. So like usual, I'm not going to mention all of the supporting cards here. I primarily want to talk about the ones that are particularly synergistic with this deck, but you can, as always, see the full deck list in the description for more details. First, I want to mention a few of our ramp pieces. Deranged Assistant and Millikan are mana dorks that cost 2 mana and tap for colorless, but they also mill you 1 card whenever you tap them for mana, so this is just another way to help us fill our graveyard and ramp us at the same time. And even in the late game, if we need more bodies, Octavia can turn these into 8/8s. Heraldic Banner is a 3-mana artifact. When it comes into play, you choose a color, and the Heraldic Banner taps for that color. It also gives all creatures you control of the chosen color +1/+0. This is actually a pretty good mana rock in a monocolor deck if you've got a lot of creatures. Almost all of the creatures and creature tokens in this deck are blue, so Heraldic Banner will boost their power while ramping us at the same time. Now for some removal spells, I want to mention Stubborn Denial. This costs just blue, and it counters target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1. But if we have a creature with power 4 or greater, it just counters that spell instead. As long as we've got Octavia in play, this is a 1-mana counter target non-creature spell, which is pretty much the best thing you'll get unless you want to pay $40 for Fierce Guardianship. Of course, we'll play Whelming Wave. This is a 4-mana sorcery that returns all creatures to their owner's hands, except for octopuses, krakens, leviathans, and serpents. This will wipe out all of our creature tokens if we have any, but obviously our commander will stick around. Perplexing Test is a new one from Strixhaven. This is an instant that costs 3 blue. It lets you choose one. Return all creature tokens to their owner's hands, or return all non-token creatures to their owner's hands. And since we're playing a token deck, this is easily a potential finisher. And if Octavia is in play when we cast this, we'll still get that Magecraft trigger, so at least one of our tokens will be an 8/8 when our opponent's blockers are bounced back to their hands. Flood of Tears is a sorcery that returns all non-land permanents to their owner's hands, but if you return 4 or more non-token permanents you control to your hand this way, you get to put a permanent from your hand onto the battlefield. Mass Bounce is pretty much Mono Blue's only way to board wipe, outside of a few artifacts like Nevinral's Disc, so we'll take this. I also realized that blue is getting a ton of actual good, efficient single target removal, which is weird and completely unnecessary, right? At first there was Reality Shift, but now we have Ravenform, Resculpt, Amphin Mutineer, and so on, so we'll include most of these. Now I want to mention a few of the lands in the deck. Gyre Reach Sanitarium taps for a colorless, but we can also pay 2 and tap it, and each player draws a card and discards a card. So again, this helps fill our graveyard for Octavia, it makes sense. Zendikar Rising introduced a bunch of MDFC lands in each color, and most of the blue ones are instants or sorceries on the front side and lands on the back side. So what's cool is that when these are in our graveyard, they are instants or sorceries that count towards the 8 that we need to get a discount on casting Octavia. And otherwise, we can play them as lands. Seagate Restoration is a 7-mana spell on the front side. It lets us draw cards equal to the number of cards in our hand. Then we have no maximum hand size for the rest of the game, and then you exile Seagate Restoration. On the back side is a land that enters tapped, unless you pay 3 life, and then it taps for blue. We're also playing 3 more of these MDFC lands. They're all instants and sorceries again on one side, and lands that enter tapped and tap for a blue on the back side. Let's be fair, you will rarely cast some of these spells. Bayene Veil is a 2-mana instant that gives all creatures your opponents control -2/-0 until end of turn. That's not very good, but it's a land if you need it, or it's an instant in your graveyard if you don't. Or you can surprise turn off a Yuriko deck for a turn if you need to. Apparently I really hate Yuriko today. Jawari Disruption is 2 mana to counter a spell unless its controller pays 1. This is unplayably bad, but it's also a land, or we can discard it to help cast Octavia, so it's in the deck. Selendi Vision is a 3 mana instant that lets us look at the top 6 cards of our library, reveal an instant or sorcery among them, put it into our hand, and put the rest on the bottom of our library. This is fine, but not great, but again, it's a land or a spell in the graveyard. So these are our noteworthy lands, ramp, and removal spells. Let's move on to the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. This Octavia Living Thesis deck has an average CMC of 3.09. We have 34 lands. This is a little lower than normal for my decks, but we have so much card draw that it works out. I am counting the 4 MDFC lands among these. There are 41 total instants and sorceries. We have 8 cards that create creature tokens. And there are 24 cards that help us fill our graveyard in some manner or another to help us cast Octavia as soon as possible. And we have 10 cards that give us card advantage. So here I'm only counting cards that when you cast or otherwise use them, you'll generate more cards into your hand than you lose by casting the cards or discarding cards and so on. And we have a lot of other cards that draw and discard to give us card selection without technically giving us card advantage, like cantrips. We have 8 sources of ramp. There are 11 pieces of single target removal and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $118.26 on tcgplayer.com. I don't have any specific budget recommendations to either power up this deck or to make it even more budget friendly. Octavia is somewhat specific in what it needs to function optimally, and there aren't often budget specific replacements for these cards. Of course, the counterspell package can always be upgraded to include things like Force of Will or Fierce Guardianship. I'm running 5 counterspells in this deck, which is about the most I'll generally include in a deck, for the most part. So there is some room here to adjust your counterspells to, based on your budget. You could also include something like Commander's Plate if you wanted to focus on commander damage. Equipping this to Octavia will make her untargetable and unblockable except by blue things, and she'll also be a 2-hit kill for commander damage. This card is currently $12. There's also the standard blue tutors like Mystical Tutor or Spellseeker. And of course, as long as you're filling your graveyard and, as a result, emptying your library, you could use something like Thassa's Oracle as an alternative win condition. These are all, fairly generically good blue cards that don't have any particular synergy with Octavia. So anyways, that is my deck tech for Octavia Living Thesis. So I think Octavia is a pretty interesting alternative to something like Talrand for a mono-blue Spellslinger Tokens deck. Now Octavia doesn't generate tokens like Talrand does, but I think now, at least just barely, we have enough permanents that make tokens when we cast an instant or sorcery that we don't need this effect in the command zone. And Octavia can easily power up your tokens to make them much more dangerous in combat. So we can turn any of our unblocked tokens into 8/8s before the combat damage step just by casting instants. And there are 25 instants in this deck. I also like that Octavia is a big creature and doesn't need to attack to generate value, so combined with her pseudo-hexproof, she can sit around and block things or discourage attackers, while generating threatening creatures that aren't afraid to attack and maybe die. But that's all I have for today. Check back in soon as I'll have some upcoming deck techs for some more commanders from Strixhaven and Commander 2021. I just released a deck tech for Shadrick Silverquill, so check that out if you're interested. I'm also working on a fairly unique build for Ruxa, Patient Professor, the bear commander that cares about vanilla creatures. I'm of course still working on Cody Vociferous Codex, and as I've said before, I think this is a really, really interesting commander, but it is quite tough to build around it in a way that makes its restriction of being unable to cast permanent spells practical. And then finally, I've got some ideas for possible deck techs for Rutha Mercurial Artist and Zimone Quandrix Prodigy. These decks aren't far enough along yet in the design process for me to know for sure whether or not I'll end up with a feasible deck, so I can't make any promises on these ones yet. And of course, if any other interesting builds present themselves for Strixhaven or Commander 2021 commanders, I'm certainly open to working on others. Anyways, that's all I have for today. Thank you for watching.